fantasy bond often what it basically is an illusion of connection to the other person. And often we form a fantasy bond with our partner, not unlike the one we formed originally with our parent, where we're fantasizing about the person, but we're not really acting in a way that's close to them anymore. So we have this fantasy of being in love with them, but our behaviors don't really match with that. The quality of relating is actually deteriorating, but we're maintaining this idea that we're still in love. So for an outside observer, it wouldn't look very loving, the relationship, but we would have this fantasy that we're really in love. And what it does is it gives us a sense of connection to another person, so we don't feel so isolated and alone. And yet it keeps a certain emotional distance between us and our partner. And a lot of the behaviors that we engage in when we have a fantasy bond create a certain emotional distance in the relationship. We don't let the person get too far away. We keep this fantasy of being fused with them, but we don't really get too close either. So we do little things that create distance. So often it's the routinized thing. We always go out on Friday night, but we're not doing it out of choice anymore. We're doing it out of expectation. We start to have a lot of shoulds. This is what we should do. This is how we should behave. These are the things we do. We talk as a unit instead of as two individual people. And we take the other person for granted. We don't really appreciate. And we also stop engaging, interacting in little ways that are kind to each other, that acknowledge the other person, that show our appreciation. And so what you get is this kind of routinized behavior. So we act as a couple, but we don't interact as two individuals who are really still loving one another. And often both people have a fantasy or illusion of being connected or in love, but the behaviors don't really look that way. And often what happens as a therapist is you see a couple come into therapy and they each read a laundry list of complaints about the other one, often that are quite accurate, but a very negative focus about their partner. And then you ask these people who seem filled with so much animosity why they stay together. They say, because we love each other. And you're like, but where's the love? It's hard to see. So in breaking down a fantasy bond, first of all, be willing to suppose that you might have elements of that in your relationship and really try to break those elements that do exist to where it's a live situation again. If you don't feel any anxiety or anticipation to see your partner, you might have a fantasy bond. If you disregard them, and don't, acknowledge their importance to you anymore, you might have a fantasy bond. Also look for ways that you've become withholding in your relationship, because part of those behaviors that create emotional distancing, one of the main ones is withholding. And that means holding back traits that your partner particularly valued or loved about you, that you're not doing those things anymore. If they loved your long hair, you may have cut your hair short. If they loved taking walks with you on the beach, you don't have time for that kind of thing anymore. If they loved listening to music with you, you're not sharing that any longer. You're not sharing the things or acting in the ways that your partner particularly loved. And reinstituting some of those behaviors can be an important way to get back to being close, to have a more loving feeling in the relationship. And the part that you can control is your side of it. So instead of pointing out all the behaviors your partner might be withholding, that's not very helpful. It's really helpful to look at yourself. What are you withholding and what could you do differently?